Hello there, and welcome to our next installment of Something Like a Sermon. Today we'll be spending some time in Mark's Gospel, the first chapter. And a few weeks ago, we looked at the introductory verses of Mark's Gospel. Actually, I did a discussion with my dad about that. Today we're going to finish out the rest of Mark chapter 1 and see what there's to see about Jesus and his ministry. Today, I'm calling this something like home field advantage. Home field advantage is something that, as many of you will know, is sort of a big deal in sports. My favorite sport, baseball, home field advantage is really important. And when it comes to a championship series, World Series, home field advantage is very important and has a lot to do with the outcome of the World Series. Except in some years where the visiting team wins every single game. But home field advantage is important. It sort of says this is our territory, and you'll have to come in here and feel uncomfortable and try to defeat us with all of our fans and with all of our atmosphere and environment and some sort of innate momentum that we have here, familiarity with the field and the place. Didn't have to travel like the visiting team does. All that sort of thing goes into home field advantage, and the fans in particular. Now, this weekend we have a important National Football League game, and I guess the idea there is technically supposed to be to take home field advantage out of it. It's supposed to be on a neutral site, and it's pretty rare that a team playing in the Super Bowl will actually be playing in their home field. Some years there is going to be an exception to that, as luck would have it. So, but anyway, I was thinking about home field advantage with important football games and stuff coming up this weekend, and I thought that's kind of what this text is about in Mark chapter 1 here. There's important discussion about home field advantage, not in a sports context, but in a theological and a spiritual context. And I'm going to focus here, even though my kids are over here laughing at me. So, all right, so Mark chapter 1. Mark introduces Jesus' ministry in a unique way. Each of the gospel writers has something to say, is saying something important about Jesus as they introduce his ministry. So Matthew famously has Jesus as the great teacher, the second Moses, giving the second law in the Sermon on the Mount and that sort of thing. Luke has his own thing, another emphasis on the teaching of Jesus. In Mark's gospel, there's a really interesting emphasis. Jesus is a teacher, but the thing that Mark demonstrates, the thing that he emphasizes, is that Jesus is a healer. And there are healings, miracles that Jesus is doing, healings, exorcisms. So there's a lot of important things we learn about Jesus. Exorcism in particular is featured here in Mark chapter 1. That's his first miracle, Jesus' first miracle. So if we learn nothing else today, it will be that great health tip: Jesus exercised, and we should too. So Mark chapter 1, if you get some time, go ahead and read the text in advance. It's starting in verse 21 through the rest of the chapter. So I'll assume that we've already been through the text or the majority of it together. I'm not going to read the whole thing in detail. But Mark here introduces Jesus' early ministry. He has called some disciples to follow him, and now he's going to begin his ministry. And the first place we find Jesus is in a synagogue. The emphasis is going to be on healing, and it's going to feature a story about a demon, a person who is possessed by a demon. And when we're in this first century context, when it comes to healing, like we'll see in the second story where Jesus heals the leper, or a demon, we see that a lot of people will, in the context of healing in particular, people come to Jesus just like they do to maybe some other sort of healer in the first century, and there was there were more than one. Jesus is one of the most famous ones, obviously, but people sought out healers, people that could heal, which was something independent from doctors. There were doctors around, but they didn't have the best reputation always, and they weren't really as effective as you'd want them to be. So healing, seeking out healers or people that can rid you of a demon, that was just just as common or more so than seeking out a doctor. Plus, maybe it was less expensive to seek out a healer. So that's why you see Jesus having so many people coming to him. That's why he gained fame and popularity in the beginning. And Mark's going to show that story, that Jesus was an incredible healer. It's hard to discuss what other people were doing as far as healing is concerned, but we have these narratives about Jesus healing. It's obvious that he was healing people, and people began to notice that. So they weren't going to the other healers, they weren't going to the doctors, they're coming to Jesus because something that he is doing is powerful and effective. And as we'll see, he has this unique authority about him. And that's the thing that Mark's going to feature in the text here. And healings and exorcisms and those sort of things, we see that featured obviously very much so in the New Testament. And this whole thing about demons and exorcisms and stuff kind of comes as a surprise when we get to the Old Testament after having been through, or when we get to the New Testament having been through the Old Testament, because it's not really featured in the Old Testament. You might wonder, well, how long has this stuff been around? How long have people been, thinking about, talking about, writing about, recording experiences, stories about demons, or that sort of thing? And I actually had that same question. How long has this been around? And while it's not featured in the Old Testament, it was certainly around in the ancient Near East. And in fact, I was watching a video the other day by Irving Finkel of British Museum fame, a philologist and Assyriologist. And he was basically going through these ancient texts, ancient cuneiform tablets, and going through like these stories about, well, here's one about ghosts and what you do and how you deal with the ghosts. Here's ones about demons and how we deal with demons. And these are like the most ancient texts that we have available. So as long as writing has been around, people have been talking about this stuff, about demons and how to deal with them. And so might not be something that's featured in the Old Testament text, but those people certainly saw or knew about that stuff. But it's definitely prevalent in the New Testament text. So here we go, finally getting to the text here. We see that Jesus is in Capernaum. On the Sabbath, he goes into a synagogue, and the people are struck by his authority. Verse 22. Now, it says that they were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching as one who has authority. Mark doesn't even mention what his teaching is. Matthew will spend chapters saying, here's what Jesus was teaching. Mark kind of just passes over. Jesus was teaching stuff. The point is that he had this amazing authority that no one had ever seen before. Not only authority in teaching, but now Mark's going to spend a lot of time talking about that authority being demonstrated in his acts, in his miracles. And just as Jesus was teaching, a guy comes into the synagogue. He's possessed by a demon. And so the issue of authority comes up here. The demon kind of the scene here, the point is that the demon is interrupting the synagogue service in which Jesus is preaching. Maybe the point is that he wants to stop Jesus or interrupt Jesus, stop him from saying the things that he's saying. And I think part of the point here is that there's a question about home field advantage. Whose territory, whose turf is this? Does it belong to the demon, or does it belong to someone else? To God, to the one that Jesus is representing, on whose behalf Jesus is speaking, and about his kingdom. Whose kingdom, whose territory is this? That's what this encounter is about. And that was already hinted at, foreshadowed earlier on in Mark chapter 1, if you remember that as well. So Jesus is an affront to this demon. And the demon wants to defend and claim this territory. And Jesus, obviously, in his teaching, is saying something very different about whose territory, whose world, whose earth this is, and whose kingdom it is, and whose kingdom it shall be in the future. So the demon says, the demon-possessed man, the demon really is saying to Jesus, what business do we have with each other? What's going on here? What's the big deal? Like, why are you coming in on my territory? What problem is there between us? Why are you infringing on my space? So he's trying to reclaim that, and he does so by speaking Jesus' name, telling him, I know who you are. And if you know about some of this stuff, you'll know that when you speak someone's name, it's a way to assert your power and authority over someone, to demonstrate that you have power and authority in a situation. So the demon says, I know who you are. You're the Holy One of God. He's naming Jesus. He's addressing him, saying, I know who you are. Here's your title. Here's your name. In other words, trying to reassert his authority, reclaim home field advantage in this situation. But Jesus quickly rebukes him and shows him who has the power and the authority, and basically dismisses him, tells him to be quiet and come out of the man. He does so, and the people are amazed again, and they say a new teaching and with authority. So Jesus is demonstrating his authority in the teaching and in his actions, in this case, in the exorcism. So the text goes on. Now, in the synagogue, there were a lot of people that day, but one of the people that was missing was Peter's mother-in-law, because she was next door at home. She was sick in bed. Well, the people told Jesus about her, and they went next door into Simon Peter's house, and Jesus raises her up and heals her. And then the next verse, there were a lot of people who were ill and demon-possessed. They were all coming to Jesus, and the whole city had gathered around the door, and he was healing those who were sick with various diseases and casting out demons. And verse 34, he was not permitting the demons to speak because they knew who he was. So there's some really interesting verses here. Back in the synagogue, Jesus says, be quiet, stop speaking, close your mouth. And here in verse 34, he didn't allow the demons to speak because they knew who he was. Now this ties into this something that's called the Messianic secret, which we'll see in a little bit here, a little bit later in Mark chapter 1. But there's this idea, and if you're interested in some fun research, you can just look that up, Messianic secret, and there's some cool stuff to learn there. But at the very least, it involves Jesus not wanting, it's based on this idea that Jesus does not want people to know immediately, vast numbers, who he is. He wants to conceal his identity, that his identity as Messiah, he wants that to remain a secret to some extent. And so he silences the demons. They're not allowed to let people know who he is. He doesn't permit them to speak. So he continues there, and he goes out on his own for some seclusion, praying. The disciples find him, say, everyone's looking for you. Jesus says, all right, well, let's go to the other nearby towns so that I can preach, proclaim the message, because that's what I came for. So here's some insight into Jesus' own perspective. I've come here to proclaim something, to preach something. And that something, as we know, is about the kingdom of God. So he's going into all the synagogues, and then in verse 40, a leper comes. A leper comes, and whether that's in the synagogue or not, we don't know. It might just be privately. And he comes to Jesus, falling on his knees, and says, if you are willing, you can make me clean. In verse 41, if you know this text, this is a famous verse, because in my translation it says, Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched the leper and said, I am willing, be cleansed. But there's a textual issue here, and there's some question as to what emotion Jesus was feeling. So a lot of Greek texts will say that Jesus was moved with compassion, and that's the emotion that he's feeling, and that makes total sense because we see that from Jesus all the time. But there's one tradition in the Greek text that says that Jesus was not feeling compassion at this point, but he was feeling anger or wrath. And so there's some texts that say that Jesus was moved with anger or with wrath, and he stretched out his hand and touched him and said, I'm willing, be cleansed. So the compassion one, if that's the right text, there's not really a big question there. We kind of get Jesus and his compassion, his empathy and love for people. But it is interesting if the text actually, if the original text of Mark actually said that he was angry, then we'd have to ask the question, why was Jesus upset in this situation? What would he be angry about? And it's hard to imagine that there would have been a long tradition of texts that said Jesus was filled with compassion, Jesus was filled with compassion, and then some later scribe said, compassion? I think Jesus was mad. I'm going to write that he was wrathful. That's hard to imagine. It's easier to imagine that a text would have said for a long time, Jesus was angry, and some scribe along the way said, I don't really like that portrait of Jesus. I think it would be better if we said compassion here. That makes more sense to me. So it's really hard to figure out whether the text originally said compassion or anger. There's a good argument for both, but maybe it was anger that Jesus was feeling at this moment. And so we have to ask the question, why? Maybe he's angry at the demon that's caused this situation of leprosy. And don't have a lot of time to discuss leprosy here in general. We did, if you had the chance to be in our class on Leviticus a while back, we talked about that in depth. So I'm sure we all remember the details of that. Anyway, but maybe another time we can talk about leprosy. I don't think that the modern understanding or definition or description of leprosy is really what's being talked about here in the Bible, especially in Leviticus. But anyway, whatever the leprosy is, this is probably a purity issue more than it is a health issue. In other words, it probably wasn't a severe threat to a person's health, but it was a severe threat to their ritual purity. And purity is kind of a sub-theme along this way. You'll notice that in the first story we talked about, what is it that the person had? There was a man with an unclean spirit. That's an interesting designation. It doesn't actually say demon, it says unclean spirit. So there's ritual, clean and unclean language, purity language associated with demon, and the same thing with leprosy, of course. There's purity issues, ritual purity. It's not about morality or sin. It's just about how certain things affect your ability, the proximity in which you can be to the temple or to the community of God, because that's not a ontological assessment of you or moral judgment. It's about symbolism, right? So in the Old Testament, a lot of this stuff has to do with tied to things that are heavily associated with life and death, and how that affects your ability to come into the temple area. So, for instance, if you have a child, there's no moral judgment about that. It's just that that is something that's strongly associated with life. Same thing if, obviously, if there's a corpse, that's death. Well, leprosy is the same thing, that symbolizes something to do with death, or it is associated with death in some way. So those strong sides, life and death, there's something important theologically and symbolically of whether or not those should be brought into the area of the temple, and so there's ritual purity things associated with it. Anyway, I just said I'm not going to talk about that, so I don't want to spend 100 hours here. But what was Jesus mad about? Was he mad about the demon that causes this in general? Was he mad about the sickness in general? Maybe that's what he's mad about. He's upset about the state of the world and the way things turned out, and why we have suffering, why we have sickness, illness, why there are the effects of evil in the world, and that's totally possible interpretation. You might also be upset because the leper doesn't take ritual purity as seriously as Jesus does. That's why I went on that tangent about ritual purity and that sort of thing. Maybe the leper is asking here, he says, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus might be upset by the fact that that the man is saying, this isn't really a big deal. It doesn't really matter to me if I am ritually pure or not, but I guess if you want to do that, you could. So there's that. And that's sort of an odd thing to say to Jesus. And Jesus says, yeah, I'm going to reach out, I'm going to touch you. That has a lot of important symbolism in and of itself. But he says, I am willing, be cleansed. He's saying this is important, not only your health and restoration, but also this thing about ritual purity, which is why he sends him to the priest. He says, go and show yourself to the priest and offer your cleansing, which Moses commanded. Offer for your cleansing the sacrifice that Moses commanded. So Jesus is interested in ritual purity and wants them to understand that, or this guy to understand that's important. So that's an option too. Not quite clear of what exactly the meaning is, but any of those could be an option. What is obvious, though, is that Jesus is upholding temple purity laws. He's not necessarily trying to do battle against the priests. He's letting them do their job, and he's upholding that, but he's also saying that he, and not the priest, is able to deal with the source of the problem, the reason why there is leprosy in the first place. The priests don't cure diseases. They observe, inspect, affirm whether someone is pure or impure, make it official. Jesus is not trying to do that role in particular here. He is going to the root of the problem. This is where his power and authority is being demonstrated, that Jesus is going to deal with the source, the cause of leprosy, and he's going to cure it. And in this story, we see again this thing about the messianic secret. In the same moment that he's telling him, go show yourself to the priest to make the sacrifice, he also says, don't say anything to anyone about this situation. Now, Jesus was more successful with the demons than he was with some of the people that he says this too in the Gospels, because this guy, while the demons were silenced and they couldn't talk about who Jesus was anymore, this guy, it says the last verse of the chapter, he went out and began to proclaim freely and spread this news all around about what happened, to such an extent that Jesus could no longer publicly enter a city. So he stayed out in the unpopulated areas, and even so, people were still coming to him from everywhere. So maybe we see why Jesus wanted to keep this a secret as long as he could. All right, well, we get asked then finally the question of why. What does all this mean? What is the point of these healings, these exorcisms? What's going on in the text? And I'll want to finish with a few words from a book. You can actually get these kind of comments from anywhere, any commentary on this text or any theology or history of Jesus. So this isn't going to be too unique, but I just happened to be reading this book this week, E.P. Sanders, The Historical Figure of Jesus. So I think he does a great job of explaining it too. So we'll give Sanders the last word here in the sermon. I just want to read a couple of paragraphs that really drive home the reason of what is going on ultimately, what this stuff means. So he says, the most important single interpretive category in the Gospels is that the miracles show that in Jesus, God was beginning the conquest of evil and its consequences, mainly suffering and death. The healing miracles reflect the view that suffering was the result of sin and evil, not necessarily the individual's fault, but just humanity in general. This is why there is such a thing as sin and that sort of, and suffering and evil, that sort of thing. And the Gospels depict Jesus as locked in pitched battle with the forces of Satan. The exorcisms in particular show him as victorious, but that is true as well as of the other healings. And a couple more lines here. More fully, he probably saw his miracles as indications that the new age was at hand. He shared the evangelist's view that he fulfills the hopes of the prophets, or at least that these hopes were about to be fulfilled. A new time would come in which pain, suffering, and death would be overcome, and the miracles pointed towards it. His miracles were signs of the beginning of God's final victory over evil. And he finishes with this statement here. Jesus did not try to prove all this in big and showy ways, and probably the crowds who flocked to him did not know, or at least did not fully understand, the eschatological context in which he himself saw his work. Miracles as such would not convey eschatological hope, but they did so only to those who understood, who were close enough to him to put his miracles into the context of his teaching, and even they remained uncertain of the significance of Jesus' deeds. He actually introduces this whole section making that point, that despite all the miracles, and when we go along for the ride with the disciples through the whole Gospel of Mark, there is incredible unbelief on the part of the disciples all the way through, despite seeing the miracles. So he says this, E.P. Sanders says, it is possible, however, that Jesus viewed his miracles as signs of the coming kingdom of God, that he taught the disciples to see them in the same way, but that they were not fully convinced. It was the resurrection that ultimately persuaded them. So even with all of this amazing, miraculous works that Jesus is doing throughout his ministry, it didn't finally click until the resurrection for the disciples. That's what Sanders says, and I think that's a really important point. The question of Mark's gospel is, what did the disciples think about Jesus? And I think that's an important question for us to finish with today. It's the ultimate question. What do you believe about Jesus? What do you think about Jesus? What has persuaded you? Blessings to you on this Lord's Day.